So for all the participants who are joining us, we are going to start really in a few minutes. So just to remember that there will be a question and answer session, so you will be able to ask questions in the chat or to raise your hand. And also very important information, you can choose your interpretation language. So you can click on the bottom of your screen, there is an interpretation button, you can choose between English and French. Bonjour à tout le monde, donc bienvenue dans notre webinaire, on va commencer.
So hello everybody, we're going to start our webinar in a few moments. Just to remind you that we will have a question and answer session during which you can ask your questions in the chat or just raise your hand. And very importantly, you have also the opportunity to have interpretation. You just click on the button down on your screen, you can choose English or French. Hello, Mr. Petit. Can you hear us? Hello, Mr. Petit. Can you hear me? Well, I can hear you anyway. So we can hear you. Can you hear us? Mr. Petit, can you hear us? We can hear you anyway. Can you hear us, Mr. Petit? Yes, Mr. Petit, can you hear us? Yes. Okay, great. So let me remind you and all participants as well that down on your screen, in the lower part of your screen, you have a button interpretation. It's the globe. And there you can choose French, the French channel.
Okay. Okay, it's just after 1 o'clock in Scotland and 2 o'clock in most of the rest of Europe. So I think we should be starting this webinar on smart mountains. How can biosphere reserves contribute to the Green Deal? My name is Martin Price and I am Director of the Centre for Mountain Studies at the University of the Highlands and Islands in Scotland. And I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to moderate this event because it brings together two networks with common interests that I have been working with for many years. And I certainly hope that one of the outcomes of this webinar will be to show how much these organizations have in common. As I expect that many of you will not have worked with both organizations or possibly with either, may I introduce them briefly. Euromontana is the Association for European Mountain Areas. It has nearly 70 member organizations across 20 countries, including my own university. It aims to work towards the sustainable development of Europe's mountain areas, recognizing that these have many distinctive characteristics, including both strengths and weaknesses. Every 2 years, Euromontana organises the European Mountain Conventions. And the next will be this September from the 21st to the 23rd. We hoped it would be in 2020, but it was postponed because of COVID. And it will take place in Sila Biosphere Reserve in southern Italy. This will be the first time that one of these large European events has been held in a biosphere reserve. And that brings us to UNESCO's Man and the Biosphere, or the MAB program. And under this, UNESCO designates biosphere reserves as learning places for sustainable development, based on a strong sense of identity and the goal of diverse stakeholders to work together. And Mariam Bouamran will provide a more detailed introduction to biosphere reserves in a few minutes. Within the World Network of Biosphere Reserves, which includes 714 members in 129 countries, there are 121 biosphere reserves just in Europe's mountains in 23 countries. And I know that some of you are from those biosphere reserves, so welcome to this webinar. As the theme of the next European Mountain Convention will be smart mountains, it's a good time to explore the clear synergies between the aims of Euromontana and the MAB program in terms of sustainability and innovation. This webinar is one of a series to set the stage for next September's European Mountain Convention. And in the next 90 minutes, we aim to show how the common goals of Euromontana and the MAB program also align with those of the European Commission. In particular, in the context of the Green Deal, we would like to explore how biosphere reserves can encourage sustainable economic development while also preserving biodiversity, and how they can encourage sustainable food and agriculture. So that's the end of my introduction. Just a couple of technical things. If you go to participants, if you click on participants, you can find the little button called More, or something else in French, I'm not sure, by your name. And if you click on that, you can add the organization where you work. So that would allow us to have not just your name, but also let us know where you're from. The second point from a technical point of view is that if you would like to ask a question later on in the question and answer session, please can you write that in the chat? Doesn't matter which language you use, French or English. So without further ado, we should move on, and we recognize that there are 4 speakers and time for discussion, but that comes after a very short video. So I should say that we're very grateful to the MAB program for providing the interpretation facilities so that we can work in both French and English. Recognizing, of course, that many of you, those are not your first or second languages, so we appreciate that you are happy to work in those languages, and we will try and speak slowly to make sure that the interpreters can translate what they hear. So without further ado, let's go to the film.
Uncle George can put his niece's mind at rest. He explains that a biosphere reserve helps humans and the environment to get along better, and it does so without damaging the lovely landscape. It doesn't need fences, just well-balanced interaction between humans and nature. Uncle George has also discovered some advantages for himself, such as opportunities to make his farm even more profitable, and this in ways that benefit nature and the region. For Uncle George, not much has changed, and Julie can continue to explore the woods and fields. But something is different. Julie is curious to find out what. The Biosphere Reserve now offers lots of new activities. Julie and other visitors can explore the area with a ranger or follow adventure trails to learn exciting facts about animals and plants. Of course, the local hotels, restaurants and tradespeople benefit from the visitors, so any doubts among the population are quickly dispelled. Many are seeing the advantages and forming corporations so that they can also participate actively in the development of the Biosphere Reserve. Julie thinks biosphere reserves are great and is almost a bit envious of her uncle because he gets to work where other people spend their holidays. And because businesses can develop so well in biosphere reserves, she might find a job there herself one day. Why not visit a biosphere reserve near you sometime? There are more of them than you think.
Great. Well, I hope that gives you a small introduction to what a biosphere reserve is. Of course, there is lots and lots of information on the UNESCO MAB website. And of course, most countries in Europe also have a national MAB committee, and they have a website too, so you could look at in your own language. So I'd now like to introduce the first speaker. That is Frank Vassen, who is a policy officer in the Nature Conservation Unit of the European Commission's Directorate General for the Environment. He also comes from one of the highest parts of Belgium, and he has been working on policy issues related mainly to biodiversity conservation for many years. So Frank, if you'd like to give your presentation, we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Martin, for this nice introduction, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure for me to talk at this event organized by Euromontana and the MAP program. As Martin said, I have primarily been working in the last 10 years on EU nature legislation on the Birds and Habitats Directive and Natura 2000. And more recently, I have also been drawn into the work on the EU Biodiversity Strategy. So let's go to the presentation. I need to share it. Right, I think you can see it now, right? So, yes, so in my presentation, I want to talk about a few aspects, not about everything, but just a few aspects of the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030, and also the EU Farm to Fork Strategy, and considering that these are aspects that are of more important interest for you. In particular, this is about the Trans-European Nature Network and EU restoration plans under the Biodiversity Strategy, and aspects of labeling of sustainable food products under the Farm to Fork Strategy. And then, if we will still have time, I will also talk about our strategy in terms of ensuring that the financing needs for nature restoration in particular are being well considered in the next multi-annual financial framework. And I will explain how we are going to do this. And I would also say a few words about the Future Life program, because I suppose that many of you are interested in that program, which is the only one that is specifically dedicated in the EU budget towards the financing of nature and biodiversity protection and restoration. So the first aspect I wanted to talk about is one of the key aspects of the new biodiversity strategy on which there is a lot of discussion right now. It is the idea of establishing a coherent trans-European nature network. But maybe this is also the occasion to say a few words about nature in general in the EU. And you probably know that all EU member states report every 6 years about the status of species and habitats. And we had the last reporting circle in 2019, so we have rather new data. And these data show us a number of things. First of all, I think in the long term, there's a lot of positive developments in relation to the recovery of large species. And this also includes the large carnivores, as many of you might know. A lot of raptors, the beaver, the otter, a lot of species that were historically persecuted are recovering well. But otherwise, there is still a lot of negative developments. And these negative developments are only very counterbalanced at a small scale by positive examples, best practice examples, in particular in the management of Natura 2000 sites. We have quite a number of good practices nowadays, showing that with the right measures and with the right resources, nature can recover, but it's still taking place at a scale that is much too small. So we really need to step up these efforts in the coming years, and that requires also additional resources and better implementation. When we talk about mountain areas, there is a particular challenge, and that challenge is linked to the maintenance of the very high biodiversity of many mountain areas that is dependent on agricultural and farming activities that are compatible with nature conservation. And the pressures, the main pressures that we see there is land abandonment. So the big challenge is to answer the question, how do we manage to keep people in the countryside? How do we manage to keep them actively managing their land in a way that is compatible with biodiversity? And this is probably one of the key issues we might need to look at more intensively in the next years. There are, of course, other pressures like pollution, invasive alien species. Climate change is big on the agenda, and it's becoming increasingly important, and also in terms of our choices in terms of nature conservation. And in particular, I think when it comes to the restoration of carbon-rich habitats, so forests and peat bogs, old growth forests are big on the discussion. So this is another issue that is of major interest, including for mountain areas. And there are sometimes conflicts between land abandonment and the restoration of forest. We are aware of this. Another issue is, and that's an issue that we have seen very recently with the COVID crisis, is that the pressure from visitors, from tourists, is increasing in certain areas because the demand for nature is increasing. And obviously, in some areas, and quite a few, the offer is smaller than the demand. So I think this is also an important point for, let's say, more extensive areas dedicated to nature conservation in the European Union. And of course, another important issue is that we cannot see the biodiversity strategy and the targets that we set in isolation. And to some extent, the targets that I'm going to present also need to be seen in the international context, in particular when it comes to quantified targets for protected areas. Think about the deforestation issue, where in fact Europe clearly has the ambition to act by example. So the next slide is about what the biodiversity strategy says about the Trans-European Nature Network. I said that we don't have enough protected areas. That is quite obvious. There is too much fragmentation. A lot of areas are too small. There is still, let's say, scientific deficiencies. Some species and habitats are not sufficiently well covered. And the target under the strategy is not really looking at these, let's say, detailed questions, but more at a general target. And the general target is a quantified one. And it says that 30% of EU land and 30% of EU seas should be under some form of protection by 2030. And in addition, 1/3 of this, which is 10%, should be under strict protection. And collectively, we should aim at creating a coherent trans-European nature network by 2030. That's the language used in the strategy. Of course, it's not about paper parks. Protected areas need effective management, which requires them to have clear conservation objectives and measures, and an active implementation. There is a need to improve our knowledge bases to better monitor and to track progress in terms of achieving the targets. And in addition to these 30%, there might be a need for additional ecological corridors to reverse fragmentation that we have encountered in the last decades. Think about the large infrastructures such as motorways or hydropower plants, which are really creating connectivity issues and may sometimes lead to the extinction of populations. On all these aspects, the strategy remains rather general, and which means that we need to clarify further what these different aspects mean and how they should be interpreted. What is protection, what is strict protection, etc. And the Commission is currently developing criteria and guidance on this in line with the provisions of a strategy, which should be ready by the end of 2021. And we are currently in the middle of the elaboration of this guidance. We have received a lot of comments on the first draft that we have discussed with Member States in October. And we will have further discussions on this in the coming months, and so that hopefully at the latest by the end of 2021 we have the finalized guidance documents. So I said I work on Natura 2000, and so far my focus has really been on our focus in the Commission has really been on the protected areas according to EU legislation, so the Birds and Habitats Directive. The Trans-European Nature Network is wider, and I think this is the first time that we at the Commission have a wider look, not only looking at Natura 2000, but also at national protected areas. So this is for us rather new. Also, we are still starting to discover the figures. There is still not really a fully coherent set of data on nationally protected areas. We have a CDDA data set, but there is still some need to clean this data set because not everything that is protected is in the CDDA really qualifies as a protected area, and likewise not all protected areas are in CDDA. So we have an effort to do with the member states in the coming years to clarify what is really our baseline. We know that Natura 2000 is 18%. If everything that is in CDDA now would be considered, we would be at 26% of the EU land area that is already protected. That would mean that we need 4% more, but it's probably a bit more than this 4%, but how much we do not know yet. And of course, there will be some new area designations that will be required. We don't know yet how much. The strategy provides a few elements in terms of what kind of criteria should be used and how this should be done, but in fact this will be clarified further in the coming months and years. The strategy also said that particular attention should be given to restored areas because any investment into restoration must be sustainable, so it would probably be worth to give it some level of protection. On the link with climate change, which I mentioned before. And the strategy says it might not only be about legally protected areas, it might also include some other concepts, such as the OECM concept, which comes from the CBD. It's other effective area-based measures. This is originally coming from the international context and the indigenous protected areas in the rainforest. But in fact, there is probably more potential to work on other than legal approaches, and we are currently exploring some of these, for example, under the concept of private land conservation, which is much more developed in the English-speaking world and in the US in particular than here in Europe, and we are currently establishing a lot of contacts with the international scene working in the private land conservation. And of course, we need to define what is the minimum criteria for a protected area, including in terms of duration. What is the minimum duration of an area that would be acceptable to count as a protected area? So there's a lot of questions still to be solved. One more controversial aspect of the strategy is the idea that at least 1/3 of these 30%, so 10% of the EU land area and 10% of the sea, should be strictly protected. In the strategy, it is mentioned that strict protection means natural processes are left essentially undisturbed. So which is of course not necessarily incompatible with some human activities, but which would basically exclude any type of resource extraction and even perhaps hunting and fishing. And this is currently one of the big discussions that we have with member states and stakeholders. I think I don't need to go into the details here. This is all about what is basically a strictly protected area, but the key issue is really whether or not strictly protected areas are only about areas that are to be left alone, like think about old growth and primary forests, peat bogs, and all these areas that have a strong value also for carbon capture and storage. Or whether it also, for example, could include certain habitats that are management dependent, but where the management would be entirely based on the requirements of nature conservation. So, for example, would it be a grassland that is fully, let's say, dedicated to biodiversity conservation, or where the management is not really a compromise between biodiversity and agronomic considerations, be considered as a strictly protected area or not? This is currently under discussion. And of course, we need, I mentioned it, we need to work on the effectiveness of the management. In the first step, it is clear, and that the strategy says that all protected areas will need to have some clearly defined conservation objectives and measures. So this is the discussion for the moment. What does it mean in practice? There's more details that will be, on which agreement will be made soon. And maybe one important or interesting point for you is really how does this relate to the biosphere reserve concept? And I see a number of links here. So I think it would really be worthwhile that you remain informed on this debate and maybe also actively contribute to it. And the aspects that I have covered here are some that are already mentioned before. Well, biosphere reserves are, well, protected or not, but there are areas that are designated under national jurisdiction. I think we can qualify them as protected areas. They have transition areas and buffer zones with some clear definitions, but which also have some degree of protection from deterioration. So they might count in this 30% target. They have core areas that are strictly protected under national legislation. So I think that clearly this would already fall under the 10% target. And they need to have clearly defined conservation objectives. So I think these are issues that you might need to, or you might want to have a closer look on in the coming years, in the question of to what extent can the biodiversity strategy contribute to the development of biosphere reserves, and vice versa, to what extent biosphere reserves can contribute to the biodiversity strategy, the European biodiversity strategy target. I should also mention that these protected area targets are not national targets. So it's not about 30% per member state and 10% per member state. It's EU level targets. So there is some flexibility, but this also creates some additional difficulties, because there is always the not in my backyard tendency for some member states to say, well, we think that more should be done by another member state. But I think it makes sense from a scientific point of view, and also it is not, certainly not totally realistic that every member state, and in particular the more populated ones, could set aside 30% or even 10% strictly protected areas. About the process on this, well, I said the guidance document is still under elaboration. By the end of 21, it should be ready. This is taking part in the frame of discussions under the Nature Directive Expert Group, the NADEC. And then we will take over with the biogeographical process. This is a seminar process where we promote exchanges of information and knowledge between the member states. This is something that we have been doing for almost 10 years now, but which will in the future, from this year onwards, be tailored more strongly to the protected area and restoration targets under the biodiversity strategy. I cannot yet give you the details of the process. This is let's say, still a moving target, but clearly we want to use the biogeographical seminar process, where member states meet at biogeographical level and discuss these issues as the main vehicle to make progress on the protected area target, so that we will have some progress already in the coming years. And so maybe this picture just shows you something about this shows you the overlap between what is European mountain areas in red and the biogeographical region. And maybe one important information here is that the mountain areas are not fully matching the alpine biogeographical region. They're wider. They go into the Atlantic region, for example, in Ireland, into the continental region in central Germany and Belgium, Luxembourg, Massif Central in France. These are not alpine areas, but I think they are mountain areas. So we also need to look at how we match, let's say, the reality on the ground with the sometimes a bit artificial biogeographic regions. But what is clear is that with the increasing shift towards online meetings and the reduced costs for such meetings, it will be easier to adapt to the specific context of the mountain regions also in that process. And just to show you an example here, this is the mountain hay meadow, which is one of the habitats that is unfortunately one of the most regressing habitats in the EU, with significant declines, mostly in areas that are subject to land abandonment. And you can see here the good match with the geography of Central Europe and some Southern European mountain massifs where this habitat is present. And actually each dot represents a certain area of this habitat in a given Natura 2000 site. So this also shows the idea of a coherence of a network, which could also be widened into the trans-European network. And another point that is important for the Trans-European Network is that it's not only anymore about the species and habitats of the nature directives, it is about the wider biodiversity. So we can also use all our knowledge that we have on other species and habitats when we talk about the prioritization of areas. So this was about the first aspect. I'd like to talk a bit about the EU Nature Restoration Plan. So it's not only about protection, it is also about restoration. We are already at the stage where we cannot keep the status quo for a number of species and habitats that are currently in a very bad conservation status. We need to reverse their situation. This is foreseen in the Nature Directive, but there is no deadline for this. So with this Nature Restoration Plan, we want to push, to give a bit of push towards the need for more active restoration, not only on Natura 2000. But the target, as we have said it here, the EU Nature Restoration Target is a target for species and habitats under the Birds Directive, including a lot of these habitats that require active management, such as mountain hay meadows and others. So the strategy says that the Commission will request and support member states to raise the level of implementation of existing legislation within clear deadlines. It will in particular request the member states to ensure that no deterioration in conservation trends and status of all protected habitats and species occur by 2030, which means that we should stop any further deterioration of any species and habitat by 2030, insofar as this is possible, by taking the necessary active management and restoration measures where this is not already taking place. But in addition, and this is the new aspect, member states will have to ensure that at least 30% of the species and habitats that are not currently in favorable status are in that category, so favorable, or show at least a positive trend. So it means that for these 30% of species and habitats that are currently in bad status, 30% of those that are in bad status, sufficient efforts should be taken in the next 2 years so that by 2030 we can measure a recovery of these species and habitats. And this is about active conservation and restoration planning, basically in line with the logic that we have under the Birds and Habitats Directive. It is not restricted to Natura 2000 because a lot of occurrences of these species and habitats are outside. So very often it will also require restoration and management needs outside the current Natura 2000 network, including in nationally protected areas or in areas that are not protected at all. And again, the strategy says that the Commission and EA will provide guidance that will be ready by 21, this time on how to select and prioritize species and habitats, because for the rest, it's really up to the member state to do that work. This slide is just to show you that the whole logic doesn't require any new monitoring framework. We are just taking the existing monitoring and reporting system under Article 17 and 12 of the Birds and Habitats Directive. We take the 2019 reporting as the baseline, the 2025 as the interim report, and the 31 report as the final one, and we might actually need to agree with member states to have that report already in 2030, so that we can really see by that time whether we have achieved the target or not. But basically, it's just about the continuation of the existing monitoring and reporting system. This time, the target applies to each member state individually. So the 30% improvement is for each member state individually. I said it's only for species and habitats of the Birds and Habitats Directive. I don't think we are missing a lot when we talk about habitats. Most of the management-dependent habitats, like species-rich grasslands, are covered by the directives. And I think the rest I mentioned already. And of course, it also covers the bird species under the Birds Directive.
Frank, do you think maybe you could speed up a little bit because we're
Yes.
over time?
Oh,
Thank
sorry.
you.
Good. Now on the selection, I don't think we need to go very much into this, but just to say that there is a number of criteria for selecting these, which are both biodiversity related and related to climate and objectives and other objectives under the strategy. So all these synergies will be discussed in the process. There will be a number of follow-up processes to help implementing the targets. I mentioned the biogeographical process before. We will also provide some support under the LIFE program, etc. Maybe I know that this aspect is of interest for you, food labeling under farm to fork. So I'm now leaving the biodiversity strategy. The farm to fork strategies, it mentions a number of interesting aspects. It says the Commission will examine ways to harmonize voluntary green claims and create a labeling framework that covers nutritional, climate, environment, and social aspects of food products. It will also consider to propose the extension of mandatory origin or provenance indications to certain food products. And it will lead the work on international sustainability standards and environmental footprint calculation methods. So I think this is quite ambitious. And of course, the objective is to make it easier for consumers to choose what they are eating. But also, it is hoped that ultimately this will lead towards an improved sustainability standard of food products. And how is this happening? I think there's two important elements here. In 2022, the Commission is planning a review of the current regulation on the provision of food information to consumers. And there is already a public consultation ongoing on 3 aspects that will be revised in that legislation. And this is ongoing until the 3rd of February 21. But maybe the more important for you is that the Commission in 2024 is planning a proposal for a new framework for sustainable food labeling. And this is quite a paradigm shift in the Commission, because so far, when it comes to food labeling, the focus was mostly on food safety and animal welfare issues. So it was rather limited. And thanks to the Green Deal, there is now a clear recognition that the scope of the food labeling needs to be widened, and that will include environmental sustainability and socio-economic aspects. So I think there is a real chance here to win something for European mountain areas, and also for environmental sustainable food production, compatible, for example, with nature conservation and with the need to keep people in the countryside in areas that are threatened by land abandonment. So this is still at an announcement stage. People are working on this in DG Sante, and the public consultation, the pre-public consultation on the Inception impact assessment will only take place at a later stage. But I think this is probably some interesting work for you to look at in the coming years. Martin, how much time do we still have? I can't hear you.
Sorry, you are a few minutes over your time, so I think maybe if you could be very quick on these last 2 points, please.
Okay, so then I will be very quick. Just shortly mention that we have another process that is probably very interesting for you, which is about encouraging member states to identify much better their financing needs for management and restoration under the Birds and Habitats Directive, both inside and outside Natura 2000. This is the so-called prioritized action frameworks, and we have received them now for most of the member states. And it shows that the financing needs for the full implementation of the Birds and Habitats Directive would be probably amount to some 30 billion euros per year EU-wide over the next 7 years. So this is double the amount that we have estimated so far, but it also includes the needs outside protected areas, and in particular species protection needs, large carnivore damage prevention, and so on and so on. And we are using this information also in the discussion with national authorities, for example, when it comes to the CAP strategic plans. So this is really an important tool for us to be able to show what are the financing needs for full implementation of the Birds and Habitats Directives. And this is ongoing work, and I think it's quite important because for the first time we really have very detailed, reliable figures on the financing needs. And the last point is about the LIFE program. The new LIFE program has just recently been adopted, and it's continuing along the main vein of what we did so far, but there will be a bit of an extension, a stronger focus, not only including the Birds and Habitats Directive and the Invasive Alien Species Regulation, but also clearly the new EU targets, the Biodiversity Strategy targets for restoration and improvement, which will open up a bit the options under the LIFE program. We have also opened up the options for higher co-funding rates, extending them to species that are in the worst threat category, both under the Birds and Habitats Directive and in the IUCN Red List. And just yesterday I established a list, and we have more than 1,500 new species from EU Red Lists, and also quite a lot of habitats not covered by the Habitats Directive that are in a very threatened situation that will be eligible for higher co-funding rates. I think we can stop here. Well, there will be other funding opportunities also under other parts of the LIFE program, but as time is over, I thank you for your attention, and I will remain available throughout the seminar for further questions. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Frank. And just on the last point, people are aware there have been quite a lot of LIFE projects in mountains, and specifically in mountain biosphere reserves in the past, so perhaps that is an opportunity for the future. We'll have time for questions later on, and as Marie mentioned, if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll come to them at the end. So I'd like to move on now to our second speaker, Miriam Boumran, who is an environmental economist and a program specialist in the MAB program and has been there since 2001. She is currently the chief of the section for ecology and biodiversity, and also coordinates the Euromab network, the oldest and largest network within the World Network of Biosphere Reserves. She's responsible for as well as all those other things, for research and training programs on access and use of biodiversity, using biosphere reserves as research and demonstration sites. And part of her family comes from the French Alps, in very much the same area as Monsieur Petit. So I'm glad to hand over now to Miriam, who will speak in French.
Merci beaucoup. Effectivement.
Thank you very much. And indeed, I'll speak French, which is my mother tongue, and also to make it easier for the English-speaking interpreter, they both do English anyway. But thank you very much for organizing this event anyway. Maybe I can just place this conversation in the crisis that we are in the middle of since almost a year now, to say that this discussion is really useful to think together what is happening to us all together on this planet, and how we in our program, in terms of biodiversity, but also my colleagues who are working at a world program, how we can collectively really address this crisis, which is also an opportunity to transform our way of doing things, and to see how this biosphere reserves, in particular in mountain areas where there is a high biodiversity with a lot of challenges, how we can contextualize this discussion in this crisis. For us at UNESCO, it is very important to show that we updated our programs. We really took that into consideration. We are all interdependent as human beings. We all depend of each other, and we see how this affects the whole planet now. So that means that what we are doing individually or in our communities at national level, this has an influence on others. This is really critical to me, to really be aware of this interdependence of human beings and our relations also with each other and with nature, as we say, which for some people seems to be outside of what we are going through as human beings. No, we are living in nature, and this has been a program which has been in existence for 50 years now, which means that we are part of everything that is alive as human beings within that nature. So we have an experimental program, and we implement this very concretely with human beings. And I can really thank people of the MAP program. I saw a number of them on the chat already. Well, we are all showing since the last 50 years that in all systems, not only mountain areas, it is quite possible to reconcile conservation with development. These are not different objectives. There is a territory with a reserve of biosphere which can be conservated, preserved, with a number of objectives, culturally speaking, and developing our knowledge. And this, while we still have our cultural life, our cultural activities. This crisis reminded us of the importance of the binding that we have as human beings. And in such a territory as a biosphere reserve in mountain areas or in other areas, we can perfectly really build a relationship, just like in other biosphere reserves in other parts of the world. So I'm really happy that we have Laurent Petit among us today, thanks to our partnership with the Association Chiefs for the Planet, because these are really stakeholders, which are already also really concerned with this evolution. I hope that Laurent Petit can share his experience with us later on as a three-star chef, just as Mr. Philippot can also share his experience. What I want to say is that it's very important that we are really negotiating now objectives with figures at international level, as Frank Vassen just mentioned. We want to have 30% protected surfaces, 10% strictly protected, which is fundamental for us at UNESCO, is that everyone should be aware that if we want to protect 30% of the planet and that the 70 other percent continue to be destroyed, and that we don't have a good relation with everything that's alive, it doesn't serve nothing. So this is really a reserve of life where we can reconcile conservation and development. And everywhere, in all ecosystems, human beings learned to live with that, to understand how things work. And it is with that knowledge that I hope that we can share with you and with the EU. We are really interested in cooperating more and to valorize everything that's being done in these biosphere reserves in the EU, but also in the whole wide world, to really put in front stakeholders which can inspire us, just like the chef, Laurent Petit, to show us what is fundamental, which is changing our relation with everything that's alive, which comes through sharing our values that we have as the MAP program, to celebrate everything that's alive and also enjoy a good meal, but also finding solutions together and really be aware of this interdependence and this connection, which means that what is at stake is to have a holistic approach that we are testing in these biosphere reserves and to share this beyond the borders of these reserves so that the whole world, if possible, and that's our goal, would really live just like in a biosphere reserve, reconciling in our daily life our link with everything that's alive and with biodiversity. Without that, we would need to separate artificially by biodiversity of what's human. Human beings are able to protect nature, to be a guardian of everything that's alive. And I think that fundamentally, this is what we would like as UNESCO through all our education programs and through our network of unique sites. This is really important, this link with culture, because we also saw in this crisis that it's very important to take into account the fundamental needs to feed ourselves, to meet each other. And when we are lucky enough, like some of us, to have good food, we should wonder, where does that food come from? And the link with earth, with farmers, with producers, with chefs of restaurants who share all that, to put it in our plate, it's very important. We want to contribute to that. We already do. And I hope that Frank Vassen will see this through the intervention of Filippo and the others, that we contributed at the level of the EU and at world level. So fundamentally speaking, this type of very concrete example, which is something that is of importance to everybody, really connect our food with everything that's alive. It's an important message that we should all take into account on this planet, also in big cities where you have big restaurants and quality restaurants. Well, this has to be done in the framework of a number of regulations, of course, and protection of biosphere, of course. But everything is not to be protected. It's much more than that. It's more holistic than that. We have a number of big cities. The capital, Dublin, is part of a biosphere reserve, or other cities in Austria. It's important that the human being takes that in his hands, feels responsible for what's happening, not only in special places, but everywhere. That is our message through MAB. So this human aspect and changing the way we consider nature. We are not destroying the planet, should not destroy the planet. We are really to maintain our link with nature, with other human beings, with farmers, with educators, with producers, young people who live also in these territories. So I really wanted to put through this message of the interdependence, of the interconnection, to deal together with climate change and the struggle against inequalities, and say that it's possible, that we are already doing this with our program. Since the last 50 years, we have a good practice, we have lessons that we learned and we can share. I hope we can do that through 2 videos. One was done in Italy, one in France, in the Alps, and this was done by people who live in biosphere reserves. They showed their own creativity, and they hope that this will be a way to change our relations with nature. Biodiversity is not something apart in protected areas. No, it is at the center of our decisions and our actions. So Marie, if you can show us these two videos, thank you for that.
Je t'ai prise de court un petit peu.
That was quick, sorry, but it's coming. Just a second. My name is Aurélie. I come from the Biosphere Reserve Luberon-Lure.
Dans le sud de la France,
in the south of France, between Luberon and the mountain of Lure, we have a collective cooperation.
La gestion de l'eau et des forêts, le géotourisme, les économies d'énergie, l'éducation du public, mais aussi le soutien à l'agriculture locale. Au restaurant scolaire du village de Cadenay, Éric Prado, le chef, accueille chaque jour 300 enfants.
Ça, c'est des pommes qui ne sont pas calibrées.
Il achète les produits en direct aux producteurs locaux comme Nicolas Mallet. L'opération De la ferme à ta cantine, lancée en 2009, permet aujourd'hui aux enfants de 30 communes de manger régulièrement des produits locaux.
Les vrais légumes, c'est là où il y a toutes les vitamines. C'est hyper important pour les enfants.
Ma réserve de biosphère is proud to share.
Ciao, sono Cristian.
Ciao, sono Daniel.
Ciao, sono Luca.
Benvenuti nella riserva di biosfera UNESCO Alpi Ledrense e Iudicaria.
Alpi Ledrense e Iudicaria, una natura rigogliosa, paesaggi curati e creati dall'uomo, antichi borghi, tradizioni, enogastronomia e vita all'aria aperta. La riserva di biosfera Alpi Ledrense e Iudicaria, racchiusa fra le Dolomiti e il lago di Garda, rappresenta un'importante sfida per la comunità locale verso la sostenibilità.
La mia riserva di biosfera è orgogliosa di condividere.
Okay, thank you very much, Mariam, for your presentation and also for these films. For those of you who are, excuse me, not involved with biosphere reserves, these are a series of films called Proud to Share, which you can find on YouTube. And there are lots of great examples from all around the world. So, excuse me, I have to cough again. May I move on to our next speaker, who is Filippo Lenzarini. And Filippo established a company called Punto Tre in 2003. His company focuses on territorial marketing and sustainable economic development strategies for protected areas and other areas with high environmental and cultural value, particularly biosphere reserves in Italy. And so we've asked him today to introduce a very exciting project called Upvivium. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Martin, for your presentation. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very proud to be part of this very interesting webinar and to present you a project that I really think is could be considered a good practice and could be also developed in other territory. I'm going to share the screen. Upvivium is from farm to fork gastronomic contest that we have realized and we want to realize again in some Italian biosphere reserve. Let's start from the contest. Italian biosphere reserve are places where there is a vast culinary excellence and high quality agricultural products. most of these products are also very connected to the conservation of landscape and also to the conservation of biodiversity, because we have a lot of different kind of species, animal and vegetables, that are still alive just because the men are cultivating and surviving them. The problem is that very few restaurants in our biosphere reserve used to cook and promote these local products. And this is a problem also from an economic point of view, because these products are very important even for the sustainable development of the local communities. The genesis of Apvivium is quite long, because the first project started in 2008 in Appennino Tosco-Emiliano. In the beginning, the promoter of this project was the Appennino Tosco-Emiliano National Park, that then in 2015, the same area, more or less, became also a biosphere reserve. In 2016, the Appennino Tosco-Emiliano Biosphere Reserve and UNESCO organized in Langhirano, in the castle of Torrechiara, an international workshop named Biosphere Reserve Branding through High Quality Product and Gastronomy. During that workshop, the idea to transform the local project of Appennino Tosco-Emiliano gastronomic contest in a project involving other Italian and European biosphere reserve. So the year after, in 2017, was launched Apvivium. Thank you also to the collaboration and support of the Italian MAB committee. What is Apvivium? We can say that Apvivium is also a small network of biosphere reserve. At the moment, in the last edition, that unfortunately is the one of 2019, because last year, in 2020, the project was stopped because of the pandemic, and so the contest was cancelled. But in the last edition, I was saying in 2019, 5 Italian biosphere reserves were partner of this project. This area are very different because we move from the north Alpi Ledrense Iudicaria. You just see the proud to share video of this biosphere reserve. We move to the center part of Italy with Delta Po, Appennino Tosco-Emiliano, and Isole di Toscana, Toscana Highlands, so on the seaside. And we have also the participation of Sila, that is in the south of Italy, a very important mountain area that will also host the Euromontana convention in next September. These areas are very different, but they are united by a common vision, the vision of sustainable development. In the last edition, in the project, has been involved more than 100 local food producers, and 37 restaurants were competing for the national prize, to become the winner of the contest. Okay, the main goal of Apvivium are several. We can say that the most important is to encourage the use of local products by the restaurants of our biosphere reserve. In our idea, in the next future, all the restaurants in a biosphere reserve will have to use mainly local products. We think that it's also very important to raise awareness of restaurateurs on the value of local food, and asking them also to promote this value among their guests through storytelling. This will help also to enhance the gastronomic heritage of our biosphere reserve, that in many cases also enhance the conservation of their cultivated and farmed biodiversity. Finally, we also think that this kind of project can stimulate a new form of sustainable tourism related to gastronomy. As any contest, also Obvivio has some simple rules. The first one is that the competition is based on a dish that should be accompanied by a drink. Normally it's a wine, but are allowed also beer or juice. The dish must contain one or more local products chosen from a list decided by each biosphere reserve. The list of local products must represent a contribution to the farmed, cultivated conservation of biodiversity, to the landscape protection, and/or to the sustainable development. In the dish, there must not be any product coming from very far away. We decided for Italy that 1,000 kilometers is the maximum allowed. No product out of season are allowed, and also are not allowed products coming from rare or endangered species. Finally, the techniques for preparing the dish should avoid any food waste. Which is the evaluation mechanism? I think that is very easy, because there is a period, quite long period, during which people can test the dishes in the restaurant, in the biosphere reserve, and they can immediately vote for their favorites through an app on a smartphone. On the basis of the online votes, some teams, we used to call it teams because they are not only restaurants, but a team is composed by food producer and restaurateurs. So on the basis of the online votes, some teams enter to a local final. Local means that it's a final at the level of biosphere reserve, where a technical jury selects the local winner. Finally, all the local winners participated to the national final, where again a technical jury, but also a jury of specialized journalists, drew up the final ranking and select the national winner. Normally, we start the project with the training of participant restaurateurs. Some specialist professionists explain to the restaurateurs how to use in the best and more sustainable way the local food. Then, during fall and winter, people can test the dishes and vote online. Normally, the Obvivio dishes are available in the restaurant during the weekend. In spring, the Biosphere Reserve organized the local final. This is normally made in cooperation with the local catering school. In this way, there is also an involvement of young people and future chefs. And in June, there is the national final. The national final is organized in Alma. Alma is the International School of Italian Cuisine. It's a very important and famous school, and it is also one of the official partners of Parma, which is one of the UNESCO Creative City for Gastronomy. In this project, the communication is very important. That's why we realized and we manage several different communication tools. And I have to say that in the last edition, both local and national newspaper and television give a lot of audience to the result of the project. About the cost, we can say that each biosphere reserve should contribute to the realization to the common activities. So in the last edition, the coordinator was the Appennino Tosco-Emiliano Biosphere Reserve. The Appennino Tosco-Emiliano collect around 8,000 euros from each biosphere reserve, and with this money has been paid all the common activities, such as the organization of the national final, the jury remuneration, all the communication activities, and of course also the prizes for the finalists and the winner. And the prizes are very, very good, very, very important. Besides, each biosphere reserve can decide how many money to invest to organize the project at its local level. We can say that the amount can move from 5,000 to 10,000 euros. What next? Well, first of all, our ambition is to be able to organize a pavilion again. We would like to organize it again for the September 2021, but we have to see how the pandemic will develop. And so at the moment, we can't be sure of this. Our other ambition is to expand the network to involve other biosphere reserve. At the moment, we received we received the request to participate to a pavilion from other Italian biosphere reserve, but in the future it will be very nice to export this project even abroad, and maybe to think to a worldwide contest in all the biosphere reserve. We also need to boost the popularity of a pavilion. And concerning this, we are thinking to create a collaboration with one of the most famous TV program connected to the food that in Italy are very popular. We need, of course, to increase the number of restaurants and food producers involved, because in this way, just in this way, we can really achieve a real result and have a real impact on sustainability. And step by step, in the next edition, we will also grow up gradually the sustainable criteria on which the contest is based. If you want to have more information, and if you want to know when it will be possible again to test some Apvivium dishes, you can follow our website, that is Apvivium, www.apvivium.it, and you can also write me for more information. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Filippo. And I'm sure we are really looking forward to the opportunity to taste good food in the places it is made, and drink, of course, again in the future. Let's hope that is possible in the not too distant future. And now for our last speaker, I would like to introduce Laurent Petit, who is a real example of what Filippo has just been speaking about. Laurent is the chef of a Michelin 3-star restaurant in the French Alps, and very much embedded in all aspects of his region, not just food and drink, but the places where they come from and the people who produce them. And we've invited him particularly because he is a member of Chefs for the Planet, the Global Information and Solutions Network for Sustainable Gastronomy, which is a partner of the MAB program. And this international coalition is dedicated to climate action, the protection of biodiversity and the environment, and the fight against food waste. It supports the transition towards organic agriculture and short food circuits, and the love of good things shared between generations, friends, and cultures, which I think is very much what we have been talking about today. So, Monsieur Petit, on vous écoute.
Bonjour à tous.
Good afternoon to you all. Can you hear me?
Oui. Merci.
So I would simply like to say that I have my own idea of gastronomy. Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you very well. The message I'd like to convey, well, what I've heard here has seemed very interesting to me. The presentations have been very clear. I would like to share a testimony in saying that we can certainly reach gastronomic excellence and that loving good food is a key to help everybody open their eyes to understand their environment, nature, the living environment. I have been working for 28 years in Annecy, and it's taken me some time before I fully understood my environment, my living environment, the living nature around me. But when you start understanding nature, interpreting nature and expressing nature, everything becomes clearer, everything becomes simpler. And it is what I call simplicity. We have the Michelin guide in France, and it is bringing together chefs and people in the catering industry. As soon as you get a Michelin star, you are considered to be close to nature, and that was not the case about 10 years ago. So there has been a change, a growing collective awareness among hotels, restaurants, chefs, and all the people working in the hotel and catering industry. So that's the first comment I would like to make. I got my 3 Michelin stars by focusing on small geographical area. I live 100 kilometers from my restaurant in the middle of the summer. Well, I operate on a radius of 100 kilometers around my restaurant in the winter. In the summer, that radius shrinks to 20 to 30 kilometers. And by working like that, we can really operate in all simplicity, or simplexity, as I call it. I created my own pie that has won 3 stars in 2019. So it is a millefeuille pie. So I could create, made with cabbage, and I could create that pie before the fishing season ended, when I realized that there were already fish eggs that were starting to be ready. So it allowed me to plan ahead of the closing of the fishing season. So I used smoked fish in order to have that product, make sure it was available after the closing of the fishing season. And I produced a sort of caviar with my fish eggs. And then I took a lot of pleasure in interpreting green cabbage through all its simplicity. And then I associated it with the word pie, which everybody understands. So the result is a millefeuille pie with green cabbage. So it really gives you the sensation of millefeuille, 1,000 layers or sheets in your mouth. And it is together with the smoked salmon-like fish, smoked fish. And then there is a sauce made with the fish eggs. And it is a great dish because it marries simplicity and complexity. It brings together simplicity and complexity. Simplicity because we had to design the pie, but when it lands on the plate of the client might think that it's only a cabbage pie, but there is something else. It has it creates a surprise. what we call the wow in cooking. And so it's a great dish. So I use wild fish, I use the cabbage from my garden, the local produce. I like the plant world, and I fully understand everything you're saying. And I think we need that understanding of our environment. We can do so much with beetroot, for example, in the summer. You can create a wonderful salad by using the flowers of herbs. Of course, the leaves are very interesting, but the flavor is much stronger in the flowers. So it makes people happy when you eat simple things that have just been picked up. They're really fresh. It becomes something giant in your mouth, and it truly generates emotions, strong emotions. So this contact with nature has been very enriching to me. And of course, there are producers behind all this work, passionate people. And it's taken me about 20 years to understand that. But when you open your eyes, when you read nature, when you listen to nature, when you understand nature, what you call biodiversity, I think we all have that around us. We just need to open our eyes and ears, and all of a sudden everything becomes very simple. There is magic in the air, and we can go very far with gastronomy. So a great product for me is now a green cabbage or chicory root. We can reach excellence. Well, that excellence has been recognized in my restaurant, and that's made me very happy. And I want to repeat that the Michelin guide is a witness of the times. They push things forward. They foster progress. The Michelin guide is published on Monday, next Monday at lunchtime, and you can look at the new Michelin stars. And I'm sure that these people are fully aware of today's world, today's needs. And the clients also of those restaurants are increasingly sensitive to these realities. The clients we receive today are intellectually interested in our cooking, and they go beyond the traditional ideas that we used to have about gastronomy. So I'm not sure about what you expect from me, but it is what I wanted to share with you.
Merci bien, Monsieur Petit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Petit.
So I think we have had a very interesting set of presentations this afternoon. I think we're all probably feeling rather hungry also after hearing this wonderful food described to us, and I hope you had your lunch before you started this webinar. I should perhaps also mention that I hadn't thought about it before, but one thing in common between Euromontana and the Euromab is that we have these fantastic buffets at both of them, produced with all the local products, either from the places where Euromontana members are coming from, or where the biosphere reserves are coming from. So I hadn't realized that connection, and I'm now remembering it, and looking forward to the next time when we meet at these meetings later in this year. So, but food isn't everything. And there are many other ways that we can link local livelihoods and local environment and biodiversity. However, that's enough talking from me for a moment. I have quite a few questions. Thank you to everyone who has sent in some questions. So we have one or two for Filippo and from Frank, and if there are questions for other people, please put them in the chat, or you could also raise your hand later. So Filippo, could you say something about storytelling within the project? You mentioned storytelling in your presentation. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, I will. The idea is that restaurants have the opportunity to get in connection with many people, especially with tourists. Tourists doesn't know about the territory, very often they don't know the story of the food of that territory. So we ask to the restaurateurs that are participating to the contest at Virium, not just to give a very good dish to eat, but also to explain to the guest the story of the food, and to say them that they can go to visit the farmer where the food is coming, and to know the story of this kind of products and the landscape in which these products are inserted. So the idea that the storytelling about the food becomes also the storytelling of the territory.
And that sounds very much like what Monsieur Petit is doing as well. So
yes, exactly.
A synergy there. Thank you. I think maybe I will change the questions around, so I will not ask the same person all the time. So Frank, could you just say something? You mentioned this concept of other effective area-based measures, and I was wondering, do biosphere reserves, would they count under those?
But it's clear that the strategy says that it doesn't need to be only legally protected areas under EU or national legislation, and other approaches might be feasible. And in fact, I mean, when you look at the original concept, it was about indigenous protected areas, where, let's say, indigenous tribes in rainforests. But the same concept could also be applied to conservation easements. So arrangements between two private bodies that have that are at least, let's say, legally enforceable, with some financial transfer, and in exchange, you know, some commitments for protection that would be more or less long term. And in fact, we are currently exploring that concept, and it might actually apply to biosphere reserves, but I think the concept of protected areas might equally apply to biosphere reserve if it is sufficiently flexible. And this is also a discussion that is not yet concluded, because I think when we talk about 30% protected areas, that's quite an ambitious target, and some flexibility will be necessary. And the strategy only says, well, protected areas, as understood in the frame of that concept, should at least have clearly defined conservation objectives. It doesn't mean that this is a classic protected area. It means that it has some clear objectives linked to biodiversity. So I mean, it's probably premature to discuss this now, but at the same time, I would invite you to stay involved in the discussion on this. And but I'll take that as a message home as well, that there might be an opportunity to look specifically at concepts such as the biosphere reserves.
Yes, Miriam, you'd like to make a comment, please.
Oui, juste pour dire que...
Yes, just to say that this is part of the discussions indeed
de la CBD.
In the framework of the agreement post 2020, to see if the idea of including the biosphere reserves can be taken on board. As we said, a biosphere reserve is more than that, more than just protected trees in a number of countries where you find these trees traditionally. In fact, we also have territories which are not the classical territories where species are protected, like planned for in the legislation. We have many of these species in the biosphere reserves. So for us, it is important at UNESCO to be able to contribute through member states to make this a very solid basis, an ambitious program, to be sure that all the efforts of our member states would be recognized, because we, as biosphere reserves, we are like avant-garde territories. We have several ministries, several bodies that are working together. We are really excellent cooperation platforms. We have links between agencies for conservation, but also forests, organizations, municipalities, villages, even big cities. And sometimes this is not what the EU considers, and so they don't take us into account. But no, if you count us within protected areas in general, it would be easy to find a way. Well, then what is at stake, as I said, is also to say, look, conservation or links with nature can be applied beyond the strictly protected areas. We should evolve towards something like that, including other preservation measures, not only for natural reserves or reservations. We would like, through our MAP program, to contribute to this, that we would go beyond this with larger areas or more institutions with all stakeholders, like Laurent Petit did also. Please listen to nature, look at nature, and be aware that we are part of it, even in an urban system which seems to be very far away from nature. But we saw in Paris and elsewhere that listening to birds singing, if you really want to listen and look at them, well, things are happening also in cities, you see. It's very important. And what the chefs are doing in big cities, very often their restaurants are in big cities, it's getting closer to nature again. Everywhere where people live, it's important. And Martin, indeed, food is not the main thing, probably, but it is important to me anyway, because you have to feed yourself every day if you want to stay alive anyway. But it is important as an example, just to show the interactions that are possible. It's not only eating, but it's the chain behind that that makes it possible for you to eat and eat differently. As Mr. Vassen said, you have to label things, eat differently. You have to change your paradigm and your norms. And doing this, probably you can refund your relation with nature. This is a very powerful way.
Thank you. Thank you, Marion. Well, I have another question from that is for really all of the speakers, which is that the last two speakers specifically mentioned private restaurants, local food and local products in private restaurants. But in the EU member states, current public procurement rules mean that it's difficult to have criteria based on place for having local food in canteens or in hospitals, in public places, in schools. And of course, as we know, if we want the future generation to understand things, we really need to get at them or talk to them in the schools and feed them in the schools with local foods. So it's just a question, are there ways that any of the panelists can think of to have more local food in schools, in hospitals, and so on? Is it important also?
Yes. Maybe I can start, Martin.
Sure, please.
In Italy, we have a specific law that allows to the public bodies to favorite local products in the public tender for public catering, so hospitals, schools. That's why we decided to concentrate Apvivium to private restaurants. Because there is no law that can say to a private restaurant to use local product or to give them some kind of priority. Besides, our idea is also to involve all kind of restaurant. So, for example, in the 37 restaurant in the last edition, we had one 2-star restaurant, but even very small local restaurant in marginal area of the mountain. So it's a democratic approach. Every restaurant can be involved.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else like to comment on that point? Okay. Right, then I have a question. You can probably read it also, Frank. You may have seen it on the text coming up it's from Tor Arnesen in Norway. And he says, Frank, we are possibly living in the middle of a mass extinction of sorts. Is it not just as important to change a culture of use of nature as the idea is with biosphere reserves? So that biosphere reserves can achieve something that strict legislation that restricts access, for example, national parks in some countries, don't. Would this perhaps be a strong argument that the EU should take a closer look at the basic thinking of the biosphere reserve concept?
Well, that's almost a philosophical question. I'm not sure I can really give an answer to this, because the question could be asked to everybody and we don't have any primacy on these kind of questions. But maybe this is also the occasion for me to mention something else. Miriam, you mentioned that in mountain areas, let's say sustainable development and biodiversity conservation are very often de facto compatible. And this is of course true. And we have a lot of examples of this. And in fact, the threat I mentioned before is more the abandonment, or the fact that living in these areas is not attractive enough anymore and people are moving out. And we see this phenomenon in a lot of areas. At the same time, we see some best practices. And I think some of the biosphere reserve best practices are things that we should promote better. And I think we should, and I think this should be one of our key work areas in the coming years. But still, I need to say a word of warning, because very often what we have seen is that the reason why, let's say, in mountain areas, conservation of biodiversity and sustainable development are compatible, because the major threat is abandonment. And sometimes, and we see this increasingly with new, let's say, economic or technological developments, with new breeds of plants, with new pesticides, it suddenly becomes, a particular area may suddenly shift from being threatened from abandonment towards being threatened from intensification. And in those cases, and we have a number of those examples, unfortunately, the whole system might collapse, because suddenly different economic interests come in. I could give some examples, but this would be going beyond the scope here. So I think we need to, it cannot only rely on voluntary approaches, and we need to have some smart ways, and this should obviously be linked also to the question of redistributing funds between different regions, for example, within the body of such as the EU. This is happening in the frame of a common agricultural policy. And I think we will need to focus also in the future on providing some support to some regions to avoid that they shift from one system, from one threat to another, while at the same time maintain let's say, the countryside alive. And this is a really important, is a very complex challenge. And there is no single, let's say, simple solution to this.
Okay, thank you, Frank. There's actually another question for you, if you don't mind, which is, if the question is, wouldn't EU countries be discouraged to increase underprotection if the 30% goal is set at the EU level? And whether it was considered to define goals more specific at the national level?
Yes, good point. It's a question that we have asked ourselves as well. In fact, the target will not be at EU level, it will be at the biogeographical region level. And I think you have seen the map, I've shown the map with the biogeographic regions. But still, I anticipate, and the question is totally valid in this respect, that there will be some discussions there. I think the Commission, when it drafted, or when we drafted this provision, were aware about the sensitivities of imposing a fixed figure per member state. The strategy says that every member state should do its fair share. And we really need to clarify in the coming years what it means in practice. And obviously we will rely to some extent on voluntary contributions from the member states. And our work is really to make sure that this can happen by providing the necessary mechanisms for cooperation on this. But it's a good question.
Fine, thank you. Okay, so a question for Miriam. How to raise awareness about biosphere reserves and to include young people in promoting and protecting them?
Alors, j'espère qu'on...
Well, I hope that we will take advantage of this 50th anniversary of the MAP program to share all practices and solutions and experiences that we accumulated in the different countries and ecosystems. I really agree also with what you just said, Frank. It's not only voluntary contribution that is going to be necessary. We really need to find ways at the level of ministries and different bodies. We see that people want to do something, but they need to be supported by municipalities and states. And it's really a partnership that should be working well. They need a cooperation platform, but they need a link at national level. This works well with the private sector and companies in these territories, and which are going to create life and really a social and economic dynamic. I also agree that in some states with ecosystems like mountain regions and others, there can be areas or communities which are more privileged because they have a bad access or a different social tissue. Young people want to go to capital city or to Lille or other cities because they are not really concerned with what they can find locally, not enough restaurants and so on. But many biosphere reserves in Europe created special territories just to show that you can create a social and economic dynamic if you invest where you live. I was thinking also of Canada, but in Germany as well. You have such a phenomenon of people leaving indeed to go to cities. They can counter that. You have to take that into account because in France, within the EU, many young people are now leaving cities to go back to rural areas to find again that link with nature. You have to be aware of these changes in our relations with nature and our way of life. We work also with young people in our MAP program, very dynamic program. And I hope that they are going to be the spokespeople of this change that we can see happening, and that will tell what they really want to have as a future life, future years. It's interesting to see what young people can convey. They don't want a job if it destroys the resources of the planet. They don't want to work in that company if that company does not respect what's alive and nature. So you have a new paradigm of new norms, new values. We see that happening. It would be interesting to share that with you because for some, we have data around the last 10 years already. The fact that you create a dynamic in a territory is also attracting a new social life based on different values now, based on environment. You can have places in biosphere reserves where they want to be 100% sustainable. Also regarding energy consumption, recycling of waste and so on. So a real change in some societies, which is going to be applied in the whole region later on. So the EU should take that into account, this new dynamic and this new way of seeing nature. I come from a family, my grandparents were farmers for both sides. And it was not something people wanted to do 20 years ago, like a chef of a restaurant. Some consider this as the best thing to do also. So I'll conclude with this. Within our MAP program, they should be the ambassadors of new jobs with a lot of respect for everything that's alive. They are our new heroes, and this is our objective that we would like to convey. So you have also young people who are really eager to do something for this way of seeing things in our network. I hope that was an answer, Martin.
Thank you, Mariam. And it's a perfect ending to our webinar. This is the first time I have done this before, and I think it has worked reasonably well. Thank you very much to all four speakers for their presentations and for making us hungry for many interesting things for the future. I think we have a lot of things to think about, whether it's about food or biodiversity protection, or especially working together, which I think was a real emphasis here, that everyone needs to do things together and not separately, and that we need really holistic approaches to think about how to move forward towards sustainable development in mountains and in biosphere reserves and in mountain biosphere reserves. And I certainly, this is, I should say, the first meeting involving both the MAB program and Euromontana, and I certainly hope that there will be future connections between them in the future. And I would also hope that there is a space in the EU legislation and the regulations and things that develop which recognizes the very special features of mountains and biosphere reserves, which Frank seems quite interested in. So that's great from our point of view. So thank you all very much, speakers. Thank you all very much, participants from really all over Europe. It has been an incredibly international meeting as far as I could see from the participants. And Euromontana will make the presentations available to everyone afterwards. And you may want to join future webinars of Euromontana in the coming months. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Merci. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Martin. I'm just waiting to be sure that everything is recorded and